Space Engineers is a game of creativity and problem solving. But one of the aspects of the game that can become somewhat disappointing to veteran players is the blueprint progression system. The fixed linear nature of the progression system has led many to decide that the only solution is to simply disable it. Today I present to you an alternative to the vanilla progression system, the mod Block Progression Schematic Hunter by jTurp and Scooba. Schematic Hunter changes the standard blueprint progression system by making each block that your engineer wants to place be an independent schematic that you need to unlock. With the mod active, you can unlock new blocks by finding a notepad containing a single block schematic randomly spawned inside NPC grids. Additionally, you can set things up using chat commands to propagate schematics into an appropriately named store block and purchase them for spacebucks. An integral part of the mod is your ability to customize the settings so that you have complete control over what blocks are unlocked by default, what blocks need to be unlocked, and how likely you are to find those schematics. The granularity of the schematic system is also a configurable setting. You can have every block be its own individual schematic, even distinguishing between small grid and large grid versions of a block. You can also set it so that groups of blocks are unlocked together. Schematic Hunter has been designed to work on a single-player save as well as a multiplayer server. In order for the mod to work, the vanilla progression setting must be turned off. Loading the mod onto a save game is done like any other mod. But because the configurable settings of the mod are managed in a set of .cfg files found within the file folder for your save game, you will need to create a save game with the mod loaded before you can change any settings. For single-player games, this folder can be found by navigating to your app data folder, roaming, Space Engineers, saves, the file with your unique 64-bit Steam ID, and then the file with the save game. Once inside, you'll find there's a storage file, and another file with the schematic progression tag. These config files, or .cfg file format, control all of the settings within the mod, from the rarity of the blocks on an independent basis from schematic to schematic, to groups of schematics that are unlocked together. There are also config files for the data saved for the entire server or the single-player playthrough, as well as a file identifying where each grid is that has been used by the mod to house a schematic. The first file I would suggest you familiarize yourself is Universal Block Settings. If we take a look at that Notepad+, we'll see that the file contains a rather large list of entries. This list is two parts. The first are blocks that are always unlocked for every character. This list can be as large or as small as you want, with the only exception being that blocks based off of the assembler cannot be locked. They are permanently unlocked. If you try and lock them, if you try and disable them, then the game will crash. But the more important part of this file, or the part that you might be looking at first, is on the bottom half. And that is starting in and about here. This file contains all block types. The Schematic Hunter mod is dynamic and reacts to and it gathers data from every other mod that you're playing with. So you could have a mod installed that adds all kinds of new block types to the game. And if they're in the game, they'll be on this list. This list is the go-to spot to find the name for the block as it's used everywhere else in this mod. After universal block settings, knowing where that list is and what the list is, you can start making a few different decisions. One is potentially the top of that same list, that same file, determining which blocks are always unlocked. When you've decided which blocks will be unlocked by default for a new character on the server, or a new character on the save game, then you will have that list built up through here. The easy way to create that list of always unlocked blocks is to copy from the bottom half of the page and paste them to the top half of the page. Using a separate notepad to copy and paste and construct is advisable because you don't necessarily want to introduce duplicates or errors in this file. Then you have to decide how to handle the remaining blocks, and that's where we go with the config file, block rarity settings. At the top of the block rarity settings config file, you'll see the setting here for information regarding the usage of a difficulty setting: easy, medium, hard, and impossible. When the mod looks at a grid to determine if it will spawn a schematic into a cargo container inside that grid, it checks to see if the grid has any of these tags on it. If the tag does exist on the grid, it will then determine the difficulty of the schematic that can be spawned. These tags can either be manually added to any grid that is permanently placed in the world, or they can be included in the display name when a grid is added to a list of possible spawns for a mod. Looking further down the config file, the first set of information here is the store item difficulty. The maximum store item difficulty, meaning when a store block populates the list of schematics it has available, it will only choose blocks that have been identified by the difficulty setting as being at a level 1 or below. Or you can set this up to the maximum difficulty of 3 if you'd like. The base price and the maximum price are a range where the schematic is randomly chooses a price between the two. Into the specific rarity section for each block, we see that it starts with the block definition, the name of the block. Now, this entry is populated by the mod based off of the list of blocks in the game. So if you've added a mod, the list will have it on universal block settings, and there'll be a corresponding entry in block rarity settings. Going down these entries in order, we see the max number in world. That is, like it sounds, the maximum number of schematics for that specific block that will ever be populated into the world. That maximum number is important because there is also a current number in world. As the mod spawns in new schematics, it will tick up the number in current number in world, up until the point when the number in world matches the maximum number. At that time, no more schematics for that specific block will be produced for the world. If for some reason your game has stopped producing any blocks, any schematics, it might be that this number here has been maximized. And depending on how you want to change the settings, you can make it so that there are a huge number in both of these that are likely never to be reached, or you can decide that there is a limited number based on how rare or precious you decide the block should be. The price modifier, the spawn chance modifier, and the store chance modifier are all numbers based off of 1 as being 100%. So the modifier times 1 is it's not a modified based off of anything else. But if you were to say 1.5 for something that was more rare or more pricey, you would change the price modifier by 1.5. Likewise, you could decide that it's a 0.5 if it were particularly cheap. Spawn chance modifier and store chance modifier are the same. The modification doesn't dictate if it's going to spawn, it dictates if it can spawn. So a 1.5 means it's 50% more likely to spawn. If it's a 0, then that means it's never going to spawn. Same dynamic can be modified for the store chance. So if a block is to show up in the store, then that's true. The last setting here, consume when opened. It's a true-false statement, so if you change this to true, then when you utilize that schematic and you pull it out of the container that it's in for the first time into your inventory, it will then stop being a schematic that can be used by other people. And that does mean that, yes, by default, a schematic can be taken out of the container it spawned in by the first person who finds it. They will learn that schematic, and then they can, if they're in a multiplayer server, sell that schematic to someone else or gift it to another person. The difficulty setting here relates to if you're going to utilize the system here that dynamically determines if a block schematic can spawn in a grid that you've identified as being easy, medium, hard, or impossible. By default, they're all set to 0, which means by default they all have an equal chance of spawning in any given grid. The next file that you'll want to look into is the research group settings config. This config file is used to establish which blocks you consider to be grouped together enough that it warrants unlocking all of them when you unlock any one of them. For instance, you might decide that all conveyor blocks can be unlocked together when you unlock any one of them. To do this, you would go to the Universal Block Settings, find in here where the conveyors are listed out. You can easily do this by hitting Control F. Here we have a section that all contains various types of conveyors. I will point out, however, that this list is not perfectly organized. So you may decide that the small block conveyor sorter and large block conveyor may need to be included in your list when you copy and paste. In this section, you can paste in to between block definitions the list of items that you want to have unlocked together. If you are using Notepad++, you'll get warnings if there is an error in your formatting, like this, where I accidentally deleted the caret. I'm going to replace that, and everything looks good again. Save your file, and to add a second group of differently linked items, you want to have another section where it says Research Group. So I'm going to copy that entire thing and paste it underneath. So there's a close bracket for a research group and an open bracket for a research group. In here, we can delete the conveyor group because we have that above, and head over and grab a different group of objects. For instance, cargo containers. We can decide that all cargo containers can be unlocked together. I've pasted that in here, and you'll see that block definitions is highlighted in being red, which means there is an error in its open bracket and close bracket function. Looking, I see that I failed to copy the entire line, so now I need to close bracket that last entry. Let's save once again, and at this point I should highlight the fact that you'll want to go to your game, load the save, exit from the save again, saving the world, and then go back to Notepad++. And you'll see here that the file has been modified. And what happened was the mod read the file, identified the intention of having these groups be formed, and then saved it in the correct format. Anytime you modify one of the lists, such as the entire list of always unlocked blocks or the block rarity settings, you'll want to do that practice of loading up your save game, closing it again, and refreshing the saves. The server save data config file contains information that controls certain aspects across the entirety of the world, such as faction sharing, which is the tool where if one person in a group learns a schematic, then all people in that group would learn it. This can be set to true or false. The next line is whether it is true or false that the mod uses the built-in spawning system. This would be used in situations where you wanted to utilize this mod on a preset world where you had already distributed specific schematics into fixed locations and did not want them spawning randomly. Use spawn timer, true or false, is a delay set into the mod where new schematics will not attempt to be spawned given a certain number of seconds between the spawns. By default, it is set to false with 0 seconds. Spawn probability %stations is if a static grid has a spawn take place inside of it. Similarly, spawn probability %ships is the same for a ship. What this really differentiates between is static grids and dynamic grids. Having that be 100% on a static grid and 60% on a dynamic grid, by default, seems to function well enough for most playthroughs, though you may find you want to change those settings. Allow multiple spawns per grid is a true or false statement. If true, then the mod will count how many blocks are on a grid, and if over 1,000, it will attempt to add a second schematic to the cargo containers of that grid. If over 2,000, it will attempt to add a third, and so forth. Allow NPC faction projections false is another dynamic of this mod that touches on a feature the mod disables, which is the ability to utilize a blueprint to project a buildable ship. If set to true, then NPC factions are capable of utilizing projectors. Beyond that, we have a list of every player who has logged into the server, identified by their 64-bit Steam ID, and a list of all blocks that have been unlocked up until the latest save of the server. This section is of note because if you are setting up a scenario for yourself, you will likely have many blocks that are unlocked that you did not intend to have unlocked throughout the remainder of your scenario. This list can be deleted down to the final entry point, and it will only be repopulated at the next save game by the universal block settings for blocks that are always unlocked. The final file to discuss is the grids containing schematics.config. There are additional files that will populate inside this folder, such as the schematic progression.log and the block progression.log. However, those are log files that simply track the behavior of the mod for diagnostic purposes. The config file, grid containing schematics, is a dynamic list of all grids that have spawned into the world, which have blocks inside their inventory. This file specifies at the very top not to alter the document. The references within the document are referencing each other and have the tendency to break if you accidentally change something without changing everything else that's supposed to happen. You can, if you're having a lot of trouble with your save, delete the entire file. The game will repopulate a new file as soon as you load it a second time, and all grids will be reset to have a new chance of containing a schematic, and the schematics inside their inventory will be refreshed. However, you will find that if you've needed to do so, you will have grids that are containing dud schematics. I hope that you found this explanation of the block progression Schematic Hunter mod useful, and thank you for watching. If you'd like to tag along for a playthrough using this mod, I have a series going on where I'm having this mod limit the amount of blueprints I have available to me, forcing me to collect things from scrap spawns where derelicts have populated the surface of a fiery volcanic landscape that does not have any native ice. And I will hopefully at some point be able to collect enough pieces and parts and learn enough blueprints that I can escape back into space. But once again, I'd like to thank you for watching. I'd like to thank jTurp and Scooba for developing the mod, and I'll see you next time.